Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 41st chapter in the book of Genesis. We're going to try and make it at least all the way up to the 44th verse. We're going to take it as far as we can as time allows. But this chapter really represents a turning point in Joseph's fortunes. Joseph was one of the sons of Jacob, and he was the child of his beloved wife, Rachel, and Rachel wasn't around because not long after she conceived Benjamin and died in childbirth, so he would have gravitated to the center of his affections. He was the child of his old age, we read in the 37th chapter where his story truly begins. And therein we learn that he was favored. Of all the 12 children of Jacob, he was the favorite one, so much so that he blessed him with an amazing and expensive coat, and he provoked the envy of his brothers who actually conspired to kill him. But at the intervention of Reuben and Judah, they end up selling him to Ishmaelite slave traders en route. But earlier in the chapter, we witnessed Joseph being visited by two dreams, symbolic dreams, and he interprets their symbolism. And one of them, for example, he pictures himself with his 11 brothers and their father bowing down to them. That's going to come true because of what happened in the chapter we'll be covering today. Then in the 38th chapter, we hear of the story. It's a slight interruption from Joseph's story. We read of Judah and Tamar, the betrothed wife of two of his wicked sons who died in succession, and he's waiting. He tells her to go home as a widow to wait till his third son grows up, and she shall marry him. But after some time, Judah's wife dies, and he steps outside of his wife, who's no longer there. He thinks that Tamar is a prostitute and goes into her. But in the 39th chapter, we read that Joseph was sold by the Ishmaelite slave traders they had exchanged him to in exchange for 20 pieces of silver. Slightly less than Judas's wage, but the name of his master is Potiphar. He is an individual of significance. He is the charge of the royal guard. And Joseph being Joseph, he was an exceptionally gifted and able individual. He rose to the most trusted position in his master's house, and he was also good looking, so he attracted the eye of his wife, who tries to seduce him, but he resists the urge, and then she frames him for trying to sexually assault her, and then he finds himself in prison in the 40th verse. There he meets two characters, both in the employ of the Pharaoh, who are the cupbearer and his baker, and they both have dreams, and he interprets them both accurately. One of them is going to live, one of them is going to die, and when it comes true, he tells whichever one he told would be spared to tell Pharaoh that I have the ability to interpret dreams. This would have been of some significant value because dreams are one of the most common forms of revelatory communications in the book of Genesis. We read that Abraham was visited in a dream in chapter 15. We also read that Lamech, one of the pagan kings, was visited by a dream. In Genesis 27, he is informed not to harm Abraham because he is a prophet. And then Jacob has his own dreams. The latter is one of them. But by Joseph, we witness the evolution of these dreams, whereas in previous dreams they were direct and straightforward, no ambiguity. Now these are distinctly non-symbolic dreams, so the contents don't require interpretation. By the time we get to Joseph, these dreams, the complexity of them expands in layers, and so there's a lot of symbolism, and he not only interpreted his own dream, remember in the 39th chapter, but he could also interpret the dreams of others, and that's what we're going to read. And even after showing the cupbearer the power which had spared him, he had requested that he mentioned him, but he didn't even think of him once he was out. And it was time to be, at the end of the 2 years' time, that Pharaoh had a dream, and saw him standing by the river. 2 years' time, Joseph underwent he was 17 years old when he was captured. He would be 30 years old when he was elevated to the prime minister position. We're going to read about that if we make it all the way to the end of our intended destiny for this. But he went through 13 years of hell, during which time he was molded and refined to someone who would be a more effective servant for Yahweh when he was exalted to his proper position of ability. So all the years as a slave and a prisoner, he did not lose his faith in his own destiny. He was a man compelled by destiny, and he saw great things for himself, and his faith in Yahweh remained intact even as he found himself a slave and a prisoner. And saw 7 cows coming up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed amongst the reeds. Then saw 7 other cows coming up after them out of the river, ugly and lean on flesh, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. So these are 2 diametrically opposite types of cow, the same number. There's 7 of them. One is healthy and good looking, and the other is maligned and ugly. And the ugly and lean of the flesh cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. Then Pharaoh awoke. So that was a pretty short dream, but profound and significant enough to compel him on the manic quest to find out its meaning. And he slept and dreamed a second time, and saw 7 heads of grain coming up on one stalk, plump and good, and saw 7 lean heads scorched by the east wind, coming up after them. So we witness a parallel in the dichotomy between cows and grain stalks, healthy and deformed. And the 7 lean heads swallowed the 7 plump and complete heads. So the same pattern and progression whereby the inferior species swallows the superior. And it came to be in the morning that his spirit was moved, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh related to them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. So all the wise men, all the magicians, all the purveyors of esoteric knowledge, all the spiritists, all the religious employees of the state of Egypt at that time, none of them could figure out what it was or what it meant or why it was so significant. But the Pharaoh does have a sense of its significance, and this is why he's running up and down his entire kingdom to find the one who can tell him what it means. Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my crimes this day, when Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, and put me in confinement in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. Each one of us dreamed a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. So he's recounting his experience when he was in prison, along with the baker who met a fatal end, as predicted by Joseph, and Joseph, the one who told them the exact meaning of their dreams. He prophesied correctly. These were prophetic dreams with visions for their future. So too is the Pharaoh's, as we will read. And there was with us a Hebrew youth, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we related to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. So he's a Hebrew youth. This would have been an obscure and virtually anonymous foreigner. The Hebrews were not even a nation yet. They were an embryonic nation of some 70 people by the time they came down to Egypt after this is getting a little far ahead of ourselves, but Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, who they are afflicted by the plague, which the sneak preview, the inferior species represents. All the adjacent people flock to Egypt because they have the grain, and that's when Joseph's recognizes his brothers. They don't recognize him, and he lays schemes and traps on them, but ultimately reveals himself, forgives them, calls their father down. He dies in Egypt. He's transplanted back to the promised land, and they remain there as a nation within a nation. And it came to be as he interpreted for us. So it came to be. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. This would have been something that Pharaoh would have been familiar with. It had happened only 2 years ago when he saw fit to execute one of his disloyal servants and to spare and restore another who had provoked his suspicion enough to land in prison. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. And he shaved and changed his garments and came to Pharaoh. So they hurriedly brought him out there. They could not get him out there soon enough, and there's probably layers and protocols for one exiting prison in the ancient world as there is the modern, and they wanted to make him presentable, so they shaved him, and he couldn't approach the Pharaoh in his prison garbs, but gave him appropriate of clothing for the occasion. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is no one to interpret it. Now I myself have heard it, and said of you that you understand a dream to interpret. So his reputation had reached the Pharaoh, as it should have some 2 years ago, but now that he was in need, it was probably better for him that it came now sooner than later, because he could step in and be the man of the hour, step in to rescue, step in to interpret him, step in to quell the chaos and confusion in his mind, set him at peace with the knowledge of knowing what this significant dream means. He has a sense of its significance, but he does not know the meaning of it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. Let Elohim answer Pharaoh with peace. So he self-depreciates himself. He does not claim any special power in himself. It is him. It is not apart from Elohim that he will be able to do it. He is the divine one who sees the heart, discerns the motives of intents, reads the mind, knows everything we ever think, even in our dreams, and can provide us illumination and insight as to what that is, if we are so called to have the gift that Joseph did. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river, and saw 7 cows coming up out of the river, fine-looking and fat, and they fed amongst the reeds. Then saw 7 other cows coming up after them, poor and very ugly, and lean of flesh. Such ugliness as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. So this is essentially a reiteration of what he earlier was described of his dream. But here we read detail that this was no ordinary ugliness, but this was severely, offensively ugly, so much so that it was unprecedented in anything he had seen in his kingdom. And the lean of flesh and ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows. Yet when they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them up, for they were as ugly as at the beginning. Then I awoke. So again, there's another additional detail that he's relating to Joseph that Moses, the author of Genesis, did not include in the original experience of the dream itself, and that is that even though they had consumed the healthy creatures, they remained unhealthy on the exterior, and on the appearance they were seemingly unchanged by what they had consumed. And I also looked in my dream and saw 7 heads coming up on one stalk, complete and good. Then saw 7 heads withered, lean, scorched by the east wind, coming up after them. So that's a somewhat inconsequential detail. Their scorching came from the direction of the east. Where it came from is not important, as the fact is that they were deformed and maligned, probably through no fault of their own. They were just at the mercy of the natural elements. And the lean heads swallowed the 7 good heads, and I spoke to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. And that's because the arts and sciences and crafts and theology of those who are estranged from the true religion, none of their practitioners are competent to diagnose or assess anything of this along this lines. They cannot accurately, they can at best convincingly give a relatable meaning, but they're not going to be able to do what Joseph is able to do, tell him what it means, what it really means, because if anyone created something, some counter truthful interpretation of this dream, it would have been a disaster for the nation of Egypt. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dream of Pharaoh is one. Elohim has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do." So even though he had dreamed two dreams, they were one in meaning. They were symbolically similar, and their parallel meaning and interpretation is going to be one. So he's preparing him that the interpretation he's going to give, he's going to treat the two as one. And he's going to, Elohim has shown him what he is about to do, but this requires a man who is acquainted with Elohim to know that it is in fact him. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. It is one dream. So once more, the symbolism and the number of them all overlap and parallel into one meaning, and the symbolism that communicates is, and the 7 lean and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads scorched by the east wind are 7 years of famine. So there's going to be 7 years of agricultural abundance, and the problem is if they take it for granted, they're going to go through it. They're going to waste food during this time when the famine is going to hit. So a famine of 7 years requires preparation. They have 7 years to prepare for this famine, and that is something they're going to need to do if they're going to survive. Now, Egypt was likened to the breadbasket of the ancient Mediterranean world. So a lot of other nations depended on them. I think the Rome when it wasn't even a village at this time. It wasn't even an idea. But by the time they flourished into a full-blown empire, even before they became officially so, they were dependent on the grain of Egypt to feed their city of some 1 million people. This is the word which I spoke to Pharaoh. Elohim has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Once more, he does not say it is he, but it is Elohim in him who had given him the power to interpret the dream, given him the discernment and the insight and the illumination as to its interpretation. See, 7 years of great plenty are coming in all the years of Egypt. So there's going to be an overflow of food. There's going to be too much food, so much so that we think we can waste it, but we really can't. We need to save some in storage for when the famine's going to hit. But after them 7 years of famine shall arise, and all the plenty be forgotten in the land of Egypt. And the famine shall destroy the land. So this is not an ordinary famine. Famines were facts of life which ancient culturalists had to contend with. They were dependent on the rain. We read somewhere in the first book of Kings that the rain did not fall on Israel during the reign of the wicked King Ahab, who was the creature of his even wickeder wife, Jezebel, and the prophet Elijah is the one through whom rain ultimately comes. But that's getting a little far away from the story itself. And but it's going to destroy the land. There's going to be nothing left if we let this famine have its way. And that the plenty shall not be remembered in the land because of the famine of food following, for it is very severe. So all that abundance, all that excess that they had known and enjoyed was going to be useless to them, because once it's gone, it's gone. It's not coming back, and there's not going to be any food from the soil, at least not enough to feed an entire nation for a period of 7 years. So we got to start thinking ahead. We got to start planning for this occurrence with the gift of foresight that this man uniquely provides. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the word is established by Elohim, and Elohim is hastening to do it. Anything Elohim sees fit to communicate is important. Anything he repeats or does twice is doubly so. The word of Elohim is as authoritative and powerful as the one to whom it belongs. And so when it visits you, you better listen and pay attention and do what he's trying to tell you to do. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man, and appoint him over the land of Egypt. So he's not, he's at best implicitly advertising his credentials. He had shown him to be a man of discernment and wisdom because no one else in the land could do what he just did. He told them the meaning of the prayer, and now he's offering his unsolicited advice, but he speaks with such authority, having just deciphered the dream uncannily accurately. He approaches the Pharaoh without being approached by him to give him this piece of advice. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint overseers over the land, to take up 1/5 of the land of Egypt, and the 7 years of plenty. So he wants to divide the land of the country of Egypt into territories which are 1/5. These would have been determined by approximate square mileage and also geographical divisions, existing ones. And these are going to be there for the 7 years of plenty. These are the ones who are going to save and monitor and preserve the excess abundance from their agricultural output. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. So they're going to preserve that which they would otherwise be inclined to put to waste, but waste is not an option when you know that for as long a period of time as we have all this food, we're going to have next to nothing which comes after it. Therefore, we must save what we have now in order to eat later. This is a survival-oriented strategy. The survival of an entire nation of people was at stake here. And the food shall be for a store of the land of the 7 years of famine of food, which shall be in the land of Egypt. And do not let the land be cut off by the famine of food. So this famine is not going to be limited to Egypt alone, but we also read it afflicted Canaan, driving Jacob to send his sons down there in order to procure grain. But Egypt will be spared from, even though it will be touched by the famine, it will be prepared and respond accordingly with the gift of foreknowledge. And the word was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. Joseph he consummately made a good impression on all he came across. He was elevated by Potiphar, who, unlike the Pharaoh, is named because he was the most exemplary of his servants. And here we witness the same thing of Pharaoh. He really had a magnetic personality. He liked people, people liked him. And Pharaoh said to his servants, could we find another like him, a man in whom is the spirit of Elohim? So he recognized there's something distinct and unusual about this man. He has the spirit of Elohim. That's the only spirit which matters, the only spirit which can interpret these dreams. And he's asking if there's another like him. This is an already settled rhetorical question because he had already scoured the land from the north to the south, to the east to the west, using every human resource he thought was at his disposal. He must have sent letters to every religious house in Egypt, but it was an obscure individual, an obscure foreigner who found himself in prison on trumped-up charges that would reveal it to him. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since Elohim has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. So he answers his earlier statement for the qualifications or conditions for the one who's going to be second only to him in authority in the land to oversee the 5 subordinates they plan over the respective divisions of Egypt. And he knows that he is uniquely discerning and uniquely wise. There's not another one like him, and Joseph is 30 years old at this time. So he had wisdom beyond his years, and the only thing I can say to young ministers is the same thing which Paul told to Timothy, let no man despise thee because of thy youth. Be over my house, you yourself, and at your word all my people shall be equipped. Only in the throne I am greater than you. So he's elevating him to his immediate subordinate. There's going to be no one in the land who can supersede his authority except him, but there's going to be no need to because he's such a faithful and servant of impeccable integrity that he's going to do everything that's in the interest of his master. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have appointed you over all the land of Egypt, all the land." So his jurisdiction is from the north to the south and the east to the west, and it is delegated directly from the absolute monarch who ruled the land. So his authority was basically the same as the Pharaoh's, because the Pharaoh would have been delegating the overseeing of this task, which may have been beyond his competence as his administrative competence, but certainly was not beyond Joseph's. And Pharaoh took his seal ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he dressed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. This is also the regalia which Belteshazzar lays on Daniel in Daniel 5. After interpreting the writing on the wall, they were visited by a vision, which is distinct from a dream as a revelation, in that it is in the conscience, in the everyday world. When you're awake, you see a theophanic manifestation, and none of them, once more history repeats itself, could understand the meaning. They understood the words but couldn't assess the meaning. That's when Daniel steps in and he politely declines the offerings that Belteshazzar gives him. "Give them to another, for your kingdom is done and your days are numbered." But there was no hint Egypt would last. In this particular dynasty, the most plausible historical candidates would be the ones who ruled during the interval between the Middle Kingdom and the late kingdom, the new kingdom of Egypt. So sometime after the reestablishment of the capital at Thebes, which was to the north, there would the foreign invaders, Hyksos, they had chariots, they had cavalry, they had horses. Egypt had nothing like it and could not hope to compete militarily against them, so they quickly subsumed them. But within a century, the Egyptians would take back control, and by this time, the most likely candidate for the one who Pharaoh knew not, who knew not Joseph in Genesis 1, 7, and 8, would have been the new king, because that would have been witnessed a resurgence in native power, and as such, they would have had a much more xenophobic attitude towards Hebrews who were foreigners than did the Hyksos, who were foreigners themselves. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried out before him, "Bow the knee," and he appointed him over all the Egypt. So he gave him the publicity and the equipment and the tools and instruments to make his authority known. He gave him chariots and people before him to present his power while he traveled in their midst. And this would have been all over the land of Egypt, so anywhere from any extremity to the other, wherever Joseph was, there too were these chariots and servants saying, "Bow the knee." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without you let no man lift his finger or foot in the land of Egypt." Pharaohs would have been invested with absolute and total control. Their authority was uncontested. They were regarded as living gods in their own day by their own people. And so their authority, they had no legal written law. It was basically whatever the Pharaoh said, whatever his whims was. And he's telling him that let no one do anything or do not do anything in Egypt, that you have my permission, you have my clearance. So the lesson of the story is our trials do pay off. Most of us won't be called to spend 13 years through living hell before being elevated to the fullness of our potential and our calling like Joseph. But God's delays are not God's denials. He had to wait a 2-year period after being bound in prison, after faithful service as a slave, and then he would be elevated to a position of authority, and he would he would save not only the nation of Egypt, but also the fledgling Hebrew nation. He makes this known eventually in the later chapters that they had tried to kill him, his brothers, but he was spared to give them life. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. Bye-bye. See you soon.